Welcome everybody to our Spring 2025 Lawns to Legumes Pollinator Plantings webinar. In this webinar, we'll be walking through the specifics, more of the how-to of planning, planting, and caring for several project types, the pocket planting, pollinator meadow, and the tree or shrub projects. Just a few housekeeping reminders as we get going. Please do stay muted throughout the duration of the presentation portion. We will be recording this webinar and sending it out to everyone afterwards. So if you do have to leave early, we'll be getting that your way. And then we'll also be probably posting it on our website as well, so you can go back and review as needed. So just to go over what we'll be covering in terms of timing for the next hour or so, we'll be hearing a presentation from two of our Metro Blooms Design Build landscape designers who we're really grateful to have here today. We'll be introducing themselves shortly. If you do have questions that come up during the presentation, we'll be using the chats tonight for those. So please enter your questions in the chat as those come up. And then with the time we have left at the end, we'll be devoting that to going through as many of your questions as we can. All right, so as I mentioned, we're grateful to be joined by two of our landscape designers, Rich Harrison and Jen Ehlert from Metro Blooms Design Builds. Jen and Rich, I'm going to pass things off to you to introduce yourselves and get started on our presentation today.
Great, thank you, Megan, and welcome everybody who's here. I'm glad to be here. Rich Harrison, co-director of design, Metro Blooms, been with Metro Blooms for 11, 12 years now, and we're continuing this Great Lawns to Legumes education program. Looking forward to talking to you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jennifer Ehlert, also co-director of design. Rich and I have worked together for a while and have been presenting Lawns to Legumes projects for a while. So we're excited to think about spring on this kind of chilly day and possibly snowy day to really think about some gardening and things you can do to help pollinators this spring coming up. So looking forward to talking to you. And take it away, Rich.
Right on. So the first thing that we're going to talk about today is assessing your property, assessing your yard. And this is really important to do some good strategic planning and figure out what to plant where, how big of a project, and where you might not want to have pollinator plantings, right? So we're going to talk about all of those factors that we're going to address here. Next slide, please. The first thing you're going to want to do is make a base map or a background, what I call it. And I find the best way to do that is get an aerial photo from either Google or your county's GIS website. So to do that, you can just Google your county name and then follow it up by GIS, which means Geographic Information Systems, but it's a mapping system that then hopefully you can navigate and find where you would enter your address. And then there's some layers that you can turn on, and you can turn on an aerial photo and zoom in onto your property and then just take a screenshot or a clip of that and then save that to your file, and then you can print that out and print it and then work off of that. Or if you're crafty and feel confident, you could just do a hand drawing like shown here. That works as well. And if you know anyone with a drone, we have a designer that got a drone this year. It's just fantastic. Because it's like, can't get more accurate information than that. So, you could also do it that way. I was just thinking about that now. But the point is to get a good overview of your property and the areas that you want to work in. And then you can start doing some planning off of that. Okay. Um, Really, the next step is to just start drawing on that map. Make a printout. If you can, make 11 by 17, a larger printout if you can. And or some people also do this in like some programs online, like PowerPoint or other graphic programs. But anyway, you'll want to show, your house, your structures, house, garage, sidewalks, patios, and fences, walls, all of those structures that you have on your site, which will impact how you'll want to treat the landscape. And, label things up and put the north arrow on there. This one's funny. I just realized that the north arrow is down, which is unusual. Usually the north arrow's up, but hey, whatever works for you, just make sure you know what way is north because that also impacts sun angles, right? And light and shade, which we'll talk about in a second. You also, lastly, before we move on, you're going to want to make sure you know where your utilities are. And you can call Gopher State One 811 or Gopher State One to have them locate them. Oftentimes, if you've got a gas meter on the side of the house, then it's going perpendicular straight out to the street. And you got sewer and water. But the most commonly hit utilities are like communication lines, like your cable and your fiber optic. And you're going to want to know where those things are because, you don't want to put a project right on top of it, although you can, but then you'll have to do some accommodating. So you're just going to want to know where those things are. And of course, underground electric. What's not going to be marked is if you have like a auxiliary building or a detached garage, oftentimes the electric line that might go from your house to that garage is not going to be marked by Gopher State One. And so I always look for a little piece of conduit on the outside of the house and then it's a straight line usually between the two. And knowing that those are usually pretty shallow as well. So, we don't want to put a legacy shade tree right on top of these utilities because you might have to replace those utilities and then that tree might be compromised. All right, we can move on. Um, the next step is hydrology. How does stormwater move across your landscape once it comes from the sky? And you can start drawing arrows on your map, what direction that water flows. And thinking about your eaves on your house. And in this one, we even went into pretty great detail to show like the pitches, the gables of the house. And so, a lot of times they form valleys and you'll have concentrated flow pouring down that valley. If you don't have gutters, and if you do have gutters, then mark your downspouts, where those downspouts are in the corners of your houses and garage, and what direction that water is flowing after it leaves that downspout. This is really important. And oftentimes, I think we'll talk about later too, but like redirecting that downspout or extending it further away. Obviously, you don't want water going into your house. So we'll mark that. Lastly, with hydrology, mark the high points and the low points. And if you have pooling in areas, then you're going to want to definitely mark that so you know exactly what's going on and you can plan it accordingly. Okay. The next step is identifying existing vegetation. And I often use a different color pen for this. In this case, we used red. And, existing trees, understory trees, shade trees. And just don't mark where the trunk is. Mark the extent of the canopy if you can, like approximately. Doesn't have to be perfect, but this also impacts what you do underneath it and how you treat the soil. Existing planting beds. Mark that on your plant so you know exactly where they are. You might want to start marking what existing vegetation you have. And there's apps for that on your phone now too, if you don't know if that property is new to you. But you're going to want to identify all of these areas. Okay. The next step is to observe the sun and the shade patterns on your landscape. So, just get out there, various times of the day and observe, where is that morning sun and shade and the lunchtime or noon and late afternoon. We're getting closer to the equinox to spring. And so the shadows are finally getting shorter and shorter as the sun gets higher into the sky. And of course, in the summer solstice, it is the shortest, it's the shortest shadows. And mark that. And this will impact, where you're going to plant different types of plants. And Jen's going to get into that. Like that shows the plant finder tool here, the blue thumb plant finder tool. There's a search engine that you can choose the light exposure. And so that's why this is important. And also, a lot of our resources will sort plants by full sun, part sun, part shade, and full shade. And again, Jen will address that. Lastly, this is really important as to what activities you're going to be doing in your landscape. One of them might be gardening. Where am I going to put my tomato plants? And if you plan to do that, you're probably going to want some good solid sun. And so, as you start planning these uses in your landscape, that sunlight shade patterns also impact that. I think the next slide gets into more planning. So this is the most exciting part. We put all that stuff together, synthesizing all that information, and then brainstorming what could I do in my yard? Where could I put a great project that benefits pollinators? The rusty patch bumblebee, right? And so consider the utilization of your space. And what activities do you want to do? Do you want to play in your landscape? Do you want to have a picnic? Do you want to have a place for the kids to play or the grandkids? And basically, my big one sentence statement is if you're not actively using your yard, if your only reason why you're walking on your lawn is to mow it, please consider converting that to native habitat. Most often it's around the fringes on the outside. Think of it as a beautiful picture frame to frame your yard. Of course, you want to consider aesthetics, and there's a place for a lawn, but why do we need so much of it? It's just a relic of the past, or at least it should be, in my opinion. And having a very beautifully manicured small lawn that we can enjoy. I do love walking on freshly mowed grass and the smell of it, but why does it have to be the entire yard? And then that stormwater management. Back to that hydrology. I think I did miss an important step, but we're going to cover rain gardens in a bit. But when you're marking those arrows of where water's flowing, mark where there could be potential locations for native plantings with deep roots to intercept that storm water and let it go into the ground. And so this is a really important step to just thinking and imagining what your yard could be. This is an actual example of a early project, one of the very first ones when Lawns to Legumes first came out. And here's an example of stormwater that's coming from a downspout. If you look in the left image, you'll see the arrows of where the water is flowing. In this particular case, it's a large driveway and impervious surfaces that's shedding stormwater, and it was all going to the corner here. And these folks wanted to start small, which I encourage all of you to do if you've never done this before, because it just is more manageable getting started. But in this case, they put a small 165 square foot rain garden where all the water is flowing off of the surface. And that gives that water pause, and it will pool and slow down and infiltrate into the ground instead of running off and maybe creating erosion, which is a really bad thing for water quality. But this is a great example of how simple a small project can be and effective. Of course, if I were designing this and I'm looking at the square footage that's draining to this area, I would probably create a much larger rain garden, but it's better than nothing. So we all got to start somewhere. All right. Jen.
Thanks, Rich. Yeah, I'm excited to talk to you guys about native plants. So once you've done your base map and you really have an idea of where you're looking to implement your pollinator planting, next we're going to talk about what types of plants, how you might want to implement that, and what you might want them to look like. So we'll talk a little bit about designing with native plants and how to really design a resilient planting for your yard. Part of the reason that native plants are so resilient are their deep roots. I think we all think about native plants and their benefits to pollinators. That may be one of the reasons that you were interested in a Lawns to Legumes grant for your yard. But it's really important to think about what's below the ground. So a lot of our native prairie plants have very, very deep roots, and you can see that in this illustration here of what those root structures look like. On the very left, you can see turf grass or lawn grass, and that's got about 3-inch deep roots. You can see it's really not doing much to say help water infiltrate into the soil. So the deep roots of all of our prairie plants, really as runoff and rain is happening as we speak, unless it's transitioned to snow out there, I'm not sure yet. It really can then follow the channels of these roots deeper into the soil. These plants are also more resilient because those deep roots can tap into moisture really deep in the soil. We all have experienced drought in recent years, and so deeper in the soil layers, there may be water to be found. And so these deep roots are able to access that. Our native plants have those deep roots and they can really be more resilient in times of drought. So that's another great reason to think about implementing native plants in your yard for pollinator benefit and to just be more resilient in general. They also don't require additional fertilizers and herbicide. So we really don't want you to be applying those to these plants for multiple reasons. One, it's just not needed. Two, it's not beneficial to the pollinators who are feeding on them. So some of the benefits of native plants really can then extend into helping create a lower maintenance landscape for you in your yard. Just to go into a little bit more detail about how the roots of native plants re-engineer the soil, this image shows you how each year about 10%, anywhere between 10% and a third of plant roots die off in our cold winters. And so what happens when they die off is that they both add organic matter to the soil when they decompose, and then they leave little channels in the soil where they have broken through, and that's going to help runoff or rainwater or stormwater get deeper into the soil profile through those channels. It also reduces compaction because their roots are able to break through some of that soil and they've reduced some of that compaction, and that additional organic matter helps retain soil moisture. We like to say that native plants provide stacked benefits. So stacked benefits means that they're not just beneficial to pollinators, they're beneficial to increasing stormwater capture, they're beneficial to pollinators, pollinator protection, and they're also beautiful and require fewer benefits, or fewer inputs. So they really do provide a number of stacked environmental benefits into your yard. While we are talking about roots and soil compaction, let's just touch on soil health for a minute. A lot of you may be in an urban area where you have a compacted soil, or you're dealing with soil that's really been used a lot, and so it might have some need for improved soil health. A few tips that we like to give for improving your soil health really begin with adding organic matter. I would say if your soil is compacted where you are planning to put in your new pollinator planting, it is really beneficial to decompact that soil. And that might mean using a shovel or a tined fork to turn and loosen the soil. We don't recommend tilling a soil with a rototiller. That tends to break the soil up so much that it pulverizes the soil and really destroys any soil fungi and microorganisms that are in the soil, and is really not beneficial in the long run. So while decompacting your soil can be helpful and you can add organic matter, just use a shovel, kind of break up that soil. You can have some big clumps in there. That's totally fine. It doesn't have to be kind of perfectly smooth soil. That really helps with that compaction when you're first planting. And that's something you don't need to do yearly, but it can be beneficial if you're starting a new planting in an area where the soil is compacted. Once you've planted, then minimize the disturbance to the soil so you can really let those plant roots get deeper into the ground, excuse me, and get established. We also note here that it's important to keep soil covered. If you have bare soil, it is subject to erosion, like Rich mentioned earlier. If we have a rain event like today and we have uncovered soil, the soil can get actually compacted from the rain falling on it. So you want some kind of soil cover. As a general rule, we often recommend using mulch in the very beginning when you're first planting. We like a really shredded or double shredded hardwood mulch. Nothing with chips, because those tend to float or wash away. So something shredded like the picture on the bottom right is really good for mulch. That doesn't mean that you need to remulch your soil every year. It's not necessary, but it's really helpful when you're getting your new plants established. It's going to protect that soil from disturbance. It's going to hold moisture into the soil, keep the soil cool, and help keep some weed pressure down while your baby new native plants are getting established. So that tends to be why we would recommend some mulch. There are lots of options like shredded leaves that you compost from your own property, things like that. There are other options if you want to source those from your own property. Mulch is just a general rule that we tend to be able to easily explain to everyone. So happy to take questions about that and mulch types. We get a lot of questions about that after the presentation. As Rich mentioned, sunlight's really important. So once you have your base map and you've really focused in on the area of your property that you are interested in putting in your new garden, I would really recommend observing it and actually taking some photos at 9 a.m., noon, 3 or 4 p.m., because that'll really help you understand. You might think it's a full sun area and it gets a lot of hot sun, really only gets 3 hours of sun a day. So it's a really good observation to do. And this is actually a pretty good time of year to do that. Obviously, we are gonna have peak sunlight on June 21st, and then it'll get a little start to wane and our daylight will wane. So kind of right about now will give you a good idea between now through to the fall. What's that start to look like and how much sunlight does this area that I'm interested in planting get? And it's a really good observation to make. You can see here how we categorize full sun. That would be more than 6 hours of direct sun shining on that place. Part sun or part shade is 3 to 6 hours, and full shade would be less than 3 hours of sun. I have one caveat here, which is that if you are in an area with lots of buildings, lots of trees, there are some places that get only 3 hours of sunlight from 1 to 4 p.m. in the afternoon. And that tends to be hotter sun than in the morning. So if you have a site where really it only gets 3 hours of sun, but it's direct hot afternoon sun, I would put that in the part sun, part shade category and make sure you select plants appropriate for that space. So it's just an observation of kind of how much intensity the sun has when it shines on the place where you're intending to plant your planting. Soil moisture is also really, really important. Go dig in your soil. Once we get a little bit warmer and we know everything is thawed out, dig in your soil. See if it's wet or dry. See if it's compacted. See if it feels really loose or feels like it needs some compost. This is an image of a rain garden. So one of the ways in which you can implement native plants is a rain garden. Obviously, that was that project example we showed initially. And rain garden plants have special needs. Those plants need to be able to tolerate wet conditions when it rains or dry conditions when it's dry, because rain gardens are constructed and designed to infiltrate runoff within 24 or 48 hours. So if it's not raining, a rain garden should look dry. We have lots and lots of resources for you that are provided on the Blue Thumb website that talk about the appropriate plants for rain gardens. And if that's how you intend to build your garden, there's so many resources available on there to help you select the right plants for that soil condition. Plant height is something to consider. I actually think it's a really important thing to consider. And sometimes I'll see folks who've selected really tall plants in a spot right next to where they're going to walk. I think this is a beautiful planting on the right. It probably flops a little bit over this sidewalk, right? So, and if you're okay with that, great. But if that bothers you, then move the taller plants to the back. You can kind of think of it like a family photo, tall folks in the back, shorter people up front. In order to make sure that you are both able to create some layering and create a view within your new planting. Think about where you're looking at it from, but also make sure that you're making it easy for you to maintain, right? So if it constantly the plants are flopping onto your existing lawn and making it difficult to mow, you might need to change those out and have them be a little shorter on the edges so that they don't do that, and so that your maintenance is a little bit easier. Some low growing plants that we love and use frequently in our designs on edges are things like pussy toes, wild strawberries, wild geranium in shady areas. Tall plants, which can be helpful for screening, would be something like Joe Pyeweed, cup plant, ironweed. There's liatris in this picture here on the right, and then lots of other native grasses that are also quite tall. And that can help provide a sense of privacy in your yard if that's what you're looking for. There are two different planting design styles that I'm going to talk about today. The first one, and I would say probably the most common by far, is plant massing. This is an example of how to use this in sunny sites. And then we also have some examples coming up of how to use this design style in shady sites as well. Plant massing simply means that you are planting in groups of, say, 3 or 5 or 7 for more visual impact. So instead of planting, to identify some of the species in the pictures on the right, instead of planting one purple coneflower, one anise hyssop, and one wild bergamot, what you're going to do is plant 5 purple coneflower spaced about a foot apart, all in the same general area. That can be really helpful for you, especially if you're new to identifying some of these native plants, because when they come up next year and you're thinking, what did I plant there? Is that the purple coneflower or is that a weed? I can't identify it yet. If they're all spaced in a very regular pattern and there's this one odd man out, that's probably the weed. And so that's really going to help you in terms of your maintenance by keeping things really simple. You're going to have a group here, a group of a different species over here. But the one thing to make sure is that you get plenty of diverse species within that larger area that you're planting. And a lot of our planting templates that are provided to you already do this for you. They kind of take the guesswork out of this, but the goal of this is to be able to help you identify the plants so that you can make your maintenance easier in the future. It can also be beneficial to pollinators because those large groupings of blooms provide forage throughout the season. They have a reliable source of nectar and pollen in this one general area, and that can be really beneficial to our pollinators. Just make sure you're planting something that's going to bloom in the spring, the summer, and then the fall, something else that'll bloom in the fall, so that you have flowering resources all season long, because that's what pollinators really need. This is an example of how to use plant massing in shady sites. Shade gardens are actually one of my favorite gardens to design, our native shade gardens. Native shade gardens tend to bloom a little earlier in the year, so a lot of the plants are evolved to bloom prior to when trees leaf out. And so that means they sort of have their moment in the spring, but there's also a lot of species in shade gardens that can bloom later in the season. So don't worry if you have a shady spot, you can certainly find flowering resources all year long. And then when plants, a lot of our shady species aren't blooming, they have beautiful texture. And that texture is really lovely to contrast, kind of like the fine texture of a lady fern in the second picture with the much broader texture, much coarser texture of the May apple or the wild ginger in the third picture. And that's wild geranium blooming in the pink in the picture on the very right. So there are lots of different options for shade gardens. So don't dismay. If that's the type of space that you have for your pollinator planting, there are a lot of great resources and a lot of great plant choices that you can use in shady sites for pollinators to benefit from. The other design style that I'm going to talk about with you today is called matrix plantings. This design style is helpful in large areas, and also I feel like it can be helpful in a boulevard. This picture is taken in what we would call the boulevard, the space between the sidewalk and the street. Often you may have regulations that require you to plant plants below a certain height. So regardless of where you are, you should always check if you're interested in planting in your boulevard. Please check your city requirements to see if there's a limit to plant height within the boulevard. It is important to keep those plants a little bit shorter, so that if, for example, a car on the street can see a child on the sidewalk, if that child decides to run into the street, we want to keep that visual pathway open for safety. Back to matrix plantings. The way matrix plantings work is you really have a primary plant. That would be a grass and a sedge, usually one of each. And those are planted in a grid. And that's why it works really well in a boulevard, because they're very rectangular. You plant those in a grid, and then in between those sedges and grasses, you can intersperse flowering resources. In this case, there is a wild onion planted, as well as that butterfly weed, which is the orange flower that you see there. It has a little bit more of a modern aesthetic. So if that's what you want and are interested in, if you feel like you're worried about your garden looking too wild, this could be a really good choice for you and doing a matrix style planting. The other benefit is that the grasses and the sedges tend to spread out and really cover the soil really quickly and outcompete any weeds that want to then also grow in that area. So they really begin to cover that base layer so that weeds just don't have a big open area to take over. So that can be a beneficial aspect of matrix plantings. Edging your planting. I love edging. I think it's great. And I think it can be really helpful in clearly delineating the different types of maintenance you might need to do in your yard. It's going to help you know where to, stop pulling the weeds. Say you want to keep weeds out of your garden, but if they're growing in your lawn, no big deal. You're just going to mow your lawn. Well, the edging is going to really help tell you where that starts and finishes. And it also gives a really clean look. So if you have a planting that you're worried about looking a little messy, you're kind of concerned about the aesthetics, then one of the things that can really help that planting look very intentional is providing edging around it. And that clean line between, say, lawn or sidewalks or paved areas and your planting really helps give a very sense of neatness to your planting. So it's a very aesthetic choice, and it helps you maintain your planting in the long run. That picture on the bottom right, you can see there's a sidewalk edge. That's a great edge to put a planting all the way up to a paved surface. You can have a brick edge in the picture on the left. There's metal edging, there's stone edge. You can also do a cut edge if you're going to be really good about maintaining your turf to mulch area. There's plenty of edger tools available, but it's just important to keep that cut edge clean, because the turf will eventually grow into the mulched area, and the mulch will spill onto the turf, and that just can begin to look really messy. So keeping a cut edge clean is really important. We don't generally recommend using plastic edging. I found that it heaves a lot in our winters, and also we just unfortunately have a lot of plastic in our soils now, and so not adding any more plastic is a good idea, and finding other sources such as individual stones, natural stone. There's a lot of different potential edging options. Signage is great. It's a really great way to help have conversations with your neighbors about what you're doing. They might be curious about the types of plants you're planting, why in the world you're removing all the turf in your boulevard. And it's just a really nice way to both communicate with your neighbors and to communicate your intent. So you might have a planting that you're hoping that pets don't, pee on, and so you want to have a sign, and your neighbors know, oh, maybe I shouldn't let my dog go here. Somebody's really working hard on their garden. So it's just a great conversation starter, a great way to communicate, is to use your Lawns to Legumes sign and be able to help, share the word about what you're doing. Okay, we're going to jump into a couple of the planting types that are available and allowable through Lawns to Legumes. I'm going to start with the most common planting type, which are pocket plantings. this is the low-hanging fruit. This is like the easiest thing for you to do. A small pocket planting can have a huge impact on the number of pollinators you see in your yard. We're just going to talk through this to start. And I would say this is probably one of the more popular planting types that folks select in the Lawns to Legumes program. Okay, so pocket plantings, as I said, they're a great way to introduce biodiversity. And also, we're all busy people, right? We're working, we've got families, we've got a lot to do. So it's a way for you to start small and make this project more accessible for you, more manageable, and kind of easier to care for. It's a little bit like dipping your toes into this whole gardening thing. And if it works out and you really enjoy it and you want to expand more, great, you can do that next year. So it's a really good way to start. Some things to consider. You've got your base map, right, that you've made. So you've kind of gone through that exercise that Rich explained. One of the things you can do is really start to draw on that. And as Rich showed in one of our designs, show where this planting might go and what that might look like. You know, a pocket planting doesn't have to be an isolated planting all on its own away from other landscaping. I really like this example because it shows how it's adding diverse native species up against the foundation of a house. So it can be a way to add plantings and expand some of your existing planting beds. So you can, if you have a small, 2-foot planting bed around your house, then you could say, remove some additional turf and expand that. And then it really flows seamlessly in with your existing landscaping. So aesthetically, that can be a really easy thing to do instead of separating, say, native planting from other foundation planting. I really prefer to see those be integrated. Once you have selected your space, you can use a hose or, you can use spray paint even to spray out where you're going to plant. And that's going to help you really visualize it or communicate that with others in your family to make sure they see what you're doing. And then you can lay the plants out before you put them in the ground. So one of the things that can be really common is we all start to plant and we just start planting and then we turn around and we realize we've planted everything in half the space. You haven't really spaced them out evenly. So you can kind of do a bit of a planning exercise where you lay out your garden bed, you remove the turf, you've laid your plants out, you kind of have an idea of what you're going to do before you start putting plants in the ground. There are resources available to you that talk about how to remove that turf. Of course, you can use a sod kicker, which is, entails some physical labor to be able to do that. You can also do solarizing. There's a lot of other ways to remove turf to start your new planting. And then, of course, you need to protect that soil from erosion. In this case, there's mulch being used, but as I said before, you can use shredded leaves as well. That makes a nice protection for the soil, especially while plants are this size. So when you look in this image, you can see there's a decent amount of space between these plants. They're just babies. They haven't fully grown in. And so it's that soil between the plants that you need to be able to protect from erosion. All right, just to touch on a couple of the design templates that we have available to you. As I said, these make it easy. This is only a 75 square foot garden. That's about, we've got here a little map. The edges are curved here, so it's 8 by 11. And if you round the edges, you get to somewhere around 75, 80 square feet. This table of the plant list shows when things are blooming. So you can see you've got something that blooms in April and May, the prairie smoke, all the way down through, say, October. We've got the giant hyssop that blooms very late in the season. The asters also bloom late in the season, and then plenty of things that are blooming in between. So lots of different species here. Actually, the first rusty patched bumblebee that I saw in my own yard was on purple giant hyssop in a very neglected area between my garage and my alley where I have some native plants that thrive, and that's one of them. So it's really a great species for that late season forage for pollinators. If you want to make your garden a little bit bigger, 150 square feet, here's an example of that. And this one is really designed for a shady garden. So if you have a shady area that's going to be where you want to plant your, pollinator planting, these are great examples. So some of the plants that I mentioned for spring are things like wild geranium, and then columbine. And then if you move through this plant list, something like the great blue lobelia, the white turtlehead, and the zigzag goldenrod all bloom later in the season. So you really can provide flowering resources for pollinators in shady areas. There are even more templates available from the Lawns to Legumes program. There's a sunny and low garden here on the left. That's really good for a boulevard. A lot of the species in there would be appropriate for many boulevard areas, or a shade garden for pollinators with a tree added to it, such as a pagoda dogwood on the right. The great thing about these templates is they also provide alternatives. So if you're looking for on the back and you say, well, I just really don't like that pearly everlasting, what is something else I could plant in its place? Or maybe you can't find it. If you go on the back of these particular templates, they provide options and substitutions on the back for each one of these species. And then finally, boulevard plantings. As I said, that's a really popular spot for native plantings and can be really successful. It's a difficult growing environment. A lot of these native species can do really well there. So we also have some boulevard planting templates, which we provide to you. We've been planting in boulevards for many years now, and I would say these are kind of our tried and true. It's a difficult growing environment, partly because of that soil compaction, pet waste, things like that. And so these planting templates do have some of our species that we feel like really tend to survive in that difficult growing environment. All right, Rich, I'll let you take it away and talk about rain gardens.
Oh, you're muted, Rich.
Well, I was signing clap and applause. I just wanted to clap, Jen. That was a lot that you covered, and it's just gets me all excited about spring. Seeing all these beautiful pictures of plants, and so I'm going to just take over for a little bit here and talk about something that I specialize in, and that's rain gardens. And the concept of rain gardens has been around for quite a long time. And really, all they are just modified perennial beds. They're just shallow depressions in the landscape that are designed to collect stormwater runoff from impervious surfaces like a rooftop or a concrete patio or even a lawn, because let's face it, lawns have very shallow root systems and they generate a lot of runoff, and that is actually the most polluted of that stormwater, which otherwise, if it drains into your street, it's polluting our natural waterways and causing all kinds of problems. And so one thing I forgot to mention in your analysis is when you're doing that hydrology, also mark where you think water is, quote unquote, getting away when it rains hard. It might be good to go out during a really good rainstorm and just observe, where that concentrated flow is going. And if there's concentrated stormwater in your landscape, you'll want to try to create a depression to slow that water down, give it some pause, and allow it to soak into the ground and filter through the earth the way nature intended it. And so that's the whole point of a rain garden. And let's go, it's just another variation of that pocket planting, but it's very specialized and technical. So I want to cover some of those technical aspects real quick. All right, next slide, please. So you're going to want to make sure that that rain garden is at least 10 feet away from your foundation at a minimum, ideally like 15 feet. The last thing you want to do is concentrate stormwater from like a downspout and then have it go back into your basement. And so you're also going to want to know what kind of soil that you actually have, because the depth of your rain garden depends on your soil's ability to infiltrate. We do have a manual on the resources that talks about infiltration tests, and that's digging like a 9-inch deep hole in an area where you think you'll want to put a rain garden and then filling up full of water and seeing how quickly the water soaks into the ground. If you have heavy clay soil, then you're going to want a very shallow rain garden. We do not want standing water on your property for more than 48 hours. You'll see different times that maybe on different resources, 24, 48, 72 hours. It does take 72 hours basically for the mosquito larvae to incubate. So we don't want it to be a mosquito breeding ground. We want it to be dry really within 24 to 48 hours after the rain event. And here in the Twin Cities where I live, the soil is, really great glacial till. It's loamy. We do have pockets of heavy clay, so you're going to want to understand that. Um, but keeping that at least 10, 15 feet away. The other constraints for rain gardens are existing trees. This is where, when I said draw where your trees are, make sure you put the canopy extent on that. That also is called the drip line of your deciduous and coniferous trees. And you're going to want to avoid putting a rain garden, especially a deeper one, within that drip line. Obviously, the closer to the tree trunk you get, the more prevalent the root systems are going to be, right? And so you don't want to disturb these roots as much. Sometimes I'll put a rain garden right on the edge of that drip line, and it's kind of a kidney shape, right? Like on the downhill side. And it's just following that drip line. And that actually works out really well and kind of cutting into those fibrous roots, the smaller ones. It's not going to really damage, especially a larger, more mature tree. But you want to be careful, especially if it's an oak. If it's an oak, also understand oak wilt and when to dig underneath an oak tree and when not to. So oak wilt disease is something to be aware of if you have oak trees. Okay, the other parts of this is the rain garden has a flat bottom. It's important that it's flat so that stormwater enters it and then infiltrates evenly and efficiently. One of the most commonly made mistakes with people who do it themselves is that the bottom that might seem flat, but it's not. And so use a carpenter level, put a 4-foot level in that and make sure it's flat. It's really, really important. That way, your soil won't clog if there's suspended sediments, if there's erosion and sediment in that soil, it won't all settle at the low spot of it and clog. That's the last thing we want to do. So rain gardens have side slopes. They're 3 horizontal to 1 vertical. That's the angle. We don't want them any steeper than that because the mulch might start all settling all at the bottom and washing off the side slopes. And so that side slope is 3 to 1, 3 horizontal to 1 vertical. And then the mulch. I think Jen suggested or mentioned it earlier. I can't remember, but we want to use double shredded hardwood mulch when we're putting mulch in rain gardens or any other areas that have like stormwater runoff where it could wash away. That's what we use on all of our projects. The reason why we use that double shredded mulch is because it's fibrous and it binds together. It locks in pretty good and it won't wash away. If you use like wood chips will float. And then if your rain garden isn't sized appropriately, your rain garden will overflow quickly, most likely, and then that mulch will wash away. I don't know how much detail I want to go into. All rain gardens have an inlet and an outlet or an overflow. And you're going to want to make sure that overflow is obviously down slope and it might be a little bit lower than the rest of your downslope area when you carve this thing out. But when you're going to be digging these rain gardens, which the depth, by the way, I mentioned depth earlier. I'd say like 90% of the rain gardens that we design in residential settings are 6 inches deep. So a 6-inch deep will be plenty for that setting. But again, make sure you understand your soils, right? But if you have a 6-inch deep rain garden, then you're going to want to make sure that the width is, well, let me back up. One last thing, sizing a rain garden, okay? I would say the majority of the rain gardens we design are also about 4 to 6 feet wide. And if you think about your wingspan is your height. So I'm 5'9", so, it's about 6 feet. If I hold a little piece of paper out to the side, it is. And so that's the pretty much the narrowest. And then they can be much longer depending on it. There is a formula in the booklet that is available online, but basically talks about the area of your runoff, your rooftop, and then it's divided by the depth of the rain garden. I'd say most of the rain gardens we design are 100 to 150 square feet per downspout. And so, if it's 6 by 20, that's 120 square feet. Can think about it that way. There's a lot of resources online for rain gardens. I love to talk about it, but I'm going to stop talking about it now. And of course, plants, we already talked about plants and understanding the right plants for the right place. The plants in the basin and the bottom are going to be wetter than the ones in the side slopes. And then incorporate that rain garden into a much larger perennial planting. But this is a great way to start because you can just put in the rain garden, and then next year or the year after, then you can start expanding those beds over time. Don't take it all on at once. It'll drive you crazy. So start small. All right, pollinator meadows. Let's move on to pollinator meadows. And this really is just a larger version of a pocket planting. And, this is listed as one of the types. Of course, all the plants, all the mulch will be reimbursed through the Lawns and Legumes program. But if you go to the next slide, we have some details. It explains a little bit more about what the pollinator meadow is all about. And so, it's a larger area. And oftentimes you could do it by seed or a seed and a combination of plugs. It's just going to be more affordable. But I would say that this is definitely a little bit more for the advanced gardener, someone who has a little bit more time on their hands, because I'm going to get into maintenance and land care and stewarding these projects. And part of it is weeding. And, the larger you go, the more you're going to have to do. But this is a definite possibility if you've got a lot larger areas that you want to convert over to native plantings. I do want to say too, for side prep and some questions about that, there's a great resource on the Xerxes Society that talks about different ways to prep the site for these, using solarization, or suffocating using sheet mulching, and things like that. And that's really important to understand because you're prepping much larger areas, and that's a good way to go. But yeah, you want to check with your seed supplier and see what they have. I know that a lot of the Blue Thumb partners like Minnesota Native Landscapes and Prairie Restorations and Twin Cities Seed, they have great seed mixes for a variety of different landscapes. But these are usually full sun. Might be pockets of part sun if you've got large shade trees on the edges. Short forbs, short flower meadows are just beautiful. It's definitely more random and more wild. And so know what you're getting yourself into with these. But just know that most plantings grown from seed or even plugs, they take a good 3 years to get established. It takes time for those roots to really take hold and establish themselves before they push themselves up and produce these beautiful blooms that you see now. So you have to be patient. You have to be in for the long haul. And using signage, like Jen said, really helps show your neighbors that this is an intentional project. And I'm just not just letting my yard go. I'm not being lazy. I'm being intentional about this. Some other things real quick about, these projects, you're going to want to protect against erosion. If you have larger areas of open soil, use a silt sock. It's a bioengineered fiber or wood fiber in a log on the downhill side, and that'll keep that sediment on the site. And also using lightweight erosion control blankets are very helpful. Erosion control blankets also have another name called germination blankets. And this is getting back to seeding. And if you are going to seed, then you're going to definitely want to keep those seeds moist during germination. And so that's the good thing about these germination blankets. They're biodegradable. They keep the moisture in so it just doesn't evaporate, and it allows those seed to germinate and then get root as quickly as possible. And then, of course, lastly, with any of these projects, find some friends. Maybe find a friend that, to help out. Let me be clear. Find some friends to help out. Many hands make light work. You all learn together. Some people know a little bit more about things than others. We all just have different knowledge, and we're sharing that and bringing our knowledge all up together. So this can be a really, really fun thing. And talk to your coach. I'm sure we're going to talk about coaching a little bit. So, okay. Jen.
Great. I'll go through some trees and shrubs here for a bit. I'll make sure we leave some time at the end for questions. Rich, just a time check for us. We want to make sure we end by 7:15 so that we leave some time for questions. We get a lot of questions about making sure that kind of the maintenance of a yard is low maintenance. If we're all, as I said before, busy people, and trees and shrubs are a great way to do that and support pollinators at the same time. Trees and shrubs can take a little bit more planning to implement because, like Rich mentioned, you don't want to plant a tree and then say have to dig up your sewer line and your nice 5-year-old tree is impacted by that work. So it takes a little bit more planning. You want to make sure you put it in the right place, but it also is a really great low maintenance way to support pollinators because a lot of our trees and shrubs bloom very early in the spring when there are not a lot of other flowering resources. And so that's why they can be so valuable. Trees are an investment in the long term. Someone, I'm sure you've heard the saying that said, when is the best time to plant a tree? About 20 years ago. So go ahead and get started on that. Get that tree in the ground to let it grow and let it start growing. They can live over 100 years, some of our mature oaks. And I know we've all seen trees, in our neighborhoods that are quite old. And so that tree cover is very valuable, both in intercepting rainwater and soaking up stormwater. They also provide shade and help with the urban heat island effect. There are lots of stacked environmental benefits of trees and shrubs. Definitely check out your sunlight conditions and your soil moisture. There are so many different wonderful trees for a variety of site conditions, but it is something you should look into just as if you would for your pollinator garden. You might always love a particular type of tree, but just not have a great spot for it to grow. And it's better to pick a tree that's going to do well in your spot than one that might not grow well because it's too shady or too dry or too wet. Other site constraints would be things like buildings, not planting them too close to buildings. You want to do some research and see how big eventually your tree gets and determine the canopy size. Most times when you look up a tree, it'll say it's going to be 40 feet tall, mature width is 35 feet wide. So divide that in half and make sure you're not any closer to your building than that width. Obviously get your utilities marked. That's where the Gopher State 1 call is so helpful so that you know that you're not planting right over an underground utility. Keep an eye on your walkways or your views or your privacy, or consider shade. There are a lot of different things to consider when you're planting your trees and shrubs, and we're getting ready to go into some more detail. We can't emphasize this enough because it is really important, is having these utilities marked. When they do come and have them marked, there is a very specific code in terms of the coloring. The one thing you want to keep an eye out for a lot is yellow. That is where your gas line is located. Gas lines are not as deep in general as water and sewer lines, and they can be hit. Obviously, that's a concern, and you want to make sure that you are having those utility lines marked before you start digging a hole deep enough to plant a tree. Other common utilities, like Rich mentioned earlier, communication systems, also sprinkler systems. Oh, those really always seem to be right in the way. Sprinkler lines, they are thankfully easily repairable. but a repair you'd have to make. And electric dog fencing is also generally right below the surface of the turf. So things to keep an eye out for. You should probably stay about 10 feet away from buried lines, such as major utilities. We're talking about gas lines, water lines, sewer lines. If you have buried electrical, stay 10 feet away from those. That way, if that excavation has to occur, then your tree won't be impacted or impacted as much as if it were right over the line. Okay, next. Using that same diagram that we had earlier, we're going to kind of go through an animation that shows you about how to select the right plants for the right place and some of the different things you might want to consider when picking a location or a space for a tree or shrub on your property. I know one of the comments earlier was about wind, and we try to address that a little bit in here. This is a theoretical space, but this can help guide some of your decisions to start. So we'll start through that animation one by one, Megan. A shade tree can be very helpful on the west side of your house. Generally speaking, Minnesota has been a heating climate, which means that we use more heat than we do cooling. So it's good to keep the south side of your house open for both sunlight and for warming in the winter. But what happens in the summer is if you get that hot afternoon sun, your house can really heat up quite a bit. And so a shade tree on the west side of your house can be very beneficial. Next, there's the sun showing you where it would be providing that shade. Go ahead. Next is a rain garden. So in this site, if a rain garden has been located, a serviceberry is a great tree to place in a rain garden. It's a small tree, so it's really going to get 15-ish feet tall and wide. It has incredibly delicious berries, flowers that are very beneficial for pollinators. And if you have a small yard or not a bunch of space, serviceberry is going to be a really good choice for you. It does like some sun, so don't plant it in an understory from a bunch of other trees. You will not have as much flower production. Next, if you want a little bit of privacy between you and your neighbor, or you want to screen some, or you even want to create a windbreak, to the person who mentioned that in the chat earlier, some columnar trees can be very helpful. They tend to be less wide, so they can be more upright and not and you can use them more in a hedge situation. So they might be like a large shrub as well. Next, if you're looking to place shrubs in your yard, you might want to put them in the back. Think of them as like the taller folks in the back of the picture. Those shrubs create almost like a framework in front of which your perennial plantings will look really nice, having that shrub framework in the back. So the shrubs can be along a fence line. They can help soften your space and help soften the outer edges from which you view. So we showed them in this drawing to be kind of around the edges of the backyard. Finally, something like an evergreen tree in the northwest of your house can help block the prevailing winter winds. So often in our area, those are coming from the northwest. And if that's a challenge for you, then that could be a good option. It's just a guide to help you think about how to place the right tree in the right place. Some common challenges when planting trees are that their root balls are circled. So you might pull the tree out. It's been growing in that pot for a long time. We do recommend that you straighten, cut, or remove those circling roots in whatever way feels appropriate for you, because they will eventually, if left in place, girdle the tree, as you can see in this center picture. You do not want to dig a hole that's too deep because it will settle. You want the crown of the tree or the root flare where the trunk turns into root to be visible, and you don't want to cover that up. We talk a little bit about that in the next slide. The root flare you can see in the picture on the left is very visible in this tree. It is where the tree starts to spread out and become roots. That should be visible. If that's not visible and there is mulch up against the trunk of the tree, we call that a mulch volcano. That's bad, and that allows insects to get into the bark. Having like a mulch donut is a way to think about it. Donuts are good, volcanoes bad. That could be a good guide for you to think about when mulching around your tree. And then these are just some of the, species of many we wanted to highlight regarding trees and shrubs. One I like to talk about is willow. It's the flowers are in the image on the very right. Willow blooms very early in the season and is the host species, as you can see here, for 355 native pollinators. So it's a great species for an early spring bloom, and it has flowers that are often a little smaller than even what our eye really picks up. We don't think of them as being very showy, but our native pollinators are relying on them for early season pollen. So these are all excellent choices if you're looking to add trees and shrubs for kind of a low maintenance pollinator benefit in your yard. I'll turn it over to you, Rich, to finish off our presentation.
Awesome. Well, now that we've gotten all this great information on how to assess our landscape, what different types of projects we might want to incorporate that is supported by lawns to legumes, let's really dial it in and figure out how we're going to take care of these landscapes. How are we going to steward this land? It is so critical. And this is actually, I think, the most important aspect of your work. Because if you don't take care of it properly, then it won't establish properly. It won't provide the blooms necessary to support the rusty bumblebee and all of her winged friends. So the first year, right after you plant, make sure you give it plenty of water. Give those plantings a good soaking, especially, you don't know how long they've been sitting in these plastic containers, right? And so get them in the ground and give them a good soaking. Now, after that, you're going to make sure that they get 1 inch of water per week at a minimum. And that's, of course, if it's not coming from the sky. So how do you know how much precipitation we've gotten? I would recommend investing in a rain gauge and put that rain gauge in an area where there's no trees or structures to block the sky. If you don't have a rain gauge, you can always use a small container like a tuna fish can or a can that has straight walls on it. And you can measure how much rain is coming down or how much comes out of your sprinkler when, yeah, well, we do have an image of that in a little bit, so I'm going to stop on that. You also, weeding, of course, is the most important thing. I've seen, a really good example of this with butterfly milkweed, that beautiful orange flower that benefits the monarch butterfly. And there was a little bit of thistle and crabgrass growing next to it. And the yellow one, it was just, covered by mulch, no other plants growing next to it. And the one with the weeds growing, that was stunted. It was about a quarter of the size because nobody pulled those weeds out. What was happening? Those weeds were sucking up the moisture. They were sucking up the nutrients. They were blocking the sun. They were blocking out all of the critical resources that these plants need to get established. And this is for the first year you want to do this. I would recommend weeding weekly at the very beginning and then dialing it back. So let's move on to the next slide. I think we do get into more detail with these. This is a great graphic. This is a graphic of Siberian elm, and there's a little round discs that float in everywhere next to your foundation. What's easier to pull, the little seedling on the left or something that's about a year old in the center? I would recommend doing it when they're little tiny seedlings and getting them out of the ground. Those are like volunteer trees like elms and maples. And of course, buckthorn, if you have had buckthorn in the site before, it takes 3 years to deplete the seeds of buckthorn. And so you're going to be pulling little seedlings. But after that 3 years, and remember, it takes 3 years for your plants to get established. So if you're weeding during this period of time, your plants are getting established, you're depleting the seed bank of all these weed seeds that are in the soil. And then after that, it's going to be way easier. So, okay, next slide, please. The second year, doesn't this look lovely? Things are coming along nicely because it's been weeded and watered properly and things are establishing nicely. Okay. And then third year and beyond, it's just lovely. Once these native plants get established, they are covering the soil, uh, and so there's less competition for weeds to get in there and to even if a weed seed did blow in there from the neighbors or wherever, it's very unlikely that it'll germinate and establish because you've got all of this competition from the intentional native plants that you have raised yourself. So, okay, next. Ongoing land care practices, again, weeding really 3 times a year after that. Again, weeding regimen, I recommend doing it at least monthly, if not more frequent. If you're doing a big area, break it up into small areas and do it weekly and just bounce around. After that, 3 times a year, just think of these great holidays, Memorial Day, 4th of July, and Labor Day. And get out there sometime during that weekend or, give or take a week. That's fine. But just use those for cues of when to get out there and pull out those weeds. And we do have a little thing on mulch. So let's go to the next one. Cutting back plants. You're going to want to do this in the spring, ideally. Now, if you've got some plants that are growing up tall and they're just really too messy for you at first, it's okay to cut them back in the fall. It's not a big deal. What happens in nature, right? And, in the prairie, well, no one cuts them back. They'll probably get chomped up by herbivores and, but anyway, cutting the back in the spring is important. Ideally, we want to wait until the average temperature is 50 degrees. When is that? That's usually when the dandelions all start to bloom. So don't be so, you know, eager to get out there and do work because there's so many pollinators that are living in that duff, in that organic matter in the garden. And so we don't want to disturb them. They're still resting and we don't want to we don't want to disturb them. So we want to leave them. It's really important to know that 30% of Minnesota bees are stem nesting bees. So when we cut down those stems, we want to leave about, knee height, about 18 inches standing. And a lot of those stem nesting bees will mine out the pith and then they'll lay their eggs inside that stem and that's their home and that's where they're raising their young. So it's a really, really fascinating process to understand. Okay, next slide, please. Mulching, again, like we don't need to continuously mulch every year. We just want to mulch where there's bare soil, and it's used to keep moisture in the soil and to suppress weeds and make it look tidy. So it refresh as needed. Usually once a year where it's needed, where there's bare soil. Inspect those troubled spots. When you're weeding, and if you let it go for a little while and you got this huge crabgrass that's just completely taken over or some other weeds, don't worry about it. Just, make sure you get them out by the roots as best you can. And then where the bare soil is, make sure that you cover that with mulch. So more weeds won't come in. And then maybe if some of your plants didn't survive because they were depleted because of the weeds, replace those plants, get new plants put in there. And that's a great way to think about it. Okay. Divide, transplant, and add new plants. Constantly be assessing your landscape and thinking about when are my plants blooming, spring, summer, and fall. And then where you're finding gaps in that blooming period, that's when you want to start targeting plants during that time because we want constant resources for pollinators, spring through the fall. Transplanting, I'm going to say one thing. Make sure that if you are going to transplant or donate plants after they've been established, make sure you're aware of the jumping worm phenomena that's happened. The best way to do this, if you think you might have jumping worms, is to wash off those roots, rinse them off, dunk them in water, and then wrap them in newspaper, give them to your friend and tell them, put this in the ground as quickly as possible. That's really the best way. There's some really good resources on wild ones, on jumping worms. and make sure you know what you're getting yourself into, because we don't want to be spreading that creature around the landscape. Okay. Again, watering. When is the best time to water? Early in the morning before the hot summer sun is baking everything and evaporating that water away. It's better to water long so that that water goes deep into the soil, and then it encourages those roots to chase that water down into the ground, and that allows those plants to get established quickly. So you don't want to just do it quickly, like for 5 minutes. You want to give it a good soaking when you do water. Okay. I already talked about measuring. Let's just move on to the next one. Weeding, again, this is really, really important. I can't stress it enough of learning to identify your plants. And, this is the beautiful thing about doing it yourself, because like you've put these plants in, they're on a grid. Maybe if you're doing matrix plantings, you know where they are. You might even want to use little bamboo stakes to identify like different species with labels. There's all kinds of ways of doing it, but get to know your plants. If you're not sure what they are, there are great apps on your phone. Picture this, iNaturalist Seek is another great one. And what I always do is, once I think I have a positive ID, and I use multiple, by the way, to verify that that's the plant, and then I'll check that species on Minnesota Wildflowers. It's another great website that talks about all the different types of plants that grow here. And so then I'll double check that to learn more about its characteristics, its growth habits, and what it likes and doesn't like. Okay. We have great resources on the Blue Thumb website. Please take advantage of them. They're there for you. We're all learning together, and I'm constantly learning all the time too. We're just growing together. So take advantage of those resources. Learn where all your native plant nurseries are. There's a great blog, thank you, Megan, on the website now that talks about all the wonderful native plant sales all throughout the metro and beyond. Plant lists, everything that Jen covered, the grantee guide, and the hive. The hive, you'll get a link about this. And I wasn't sure if Megan, you were going to say anything about this. This is the last slide too, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess I'll just mention
Yeah, jump in, Megan.
all of you should be on our email newsletter for grant participants. So we kind of link all of these resources on there and navigate you to the best places to go. If you have any questions about where to find a resource, I'm going to put our helpline email in the chat.
Yeah, what year is this now? Is this year 5 of Lawns to Legumes? Am I right? Oh, it's 5 years old. What a wonderful age. And there's more resources out there than ever before. And it's refined. So this is a really good time to be entering the program, y'all.
Great. Well, thank you both, Jen and Rich. This was a really jam-packed, informative presentation. I see that you both have been getting to some of the questions already, but I'm just gonna kind of read out loud the ones that I believe are still unanswered. Okay, so we had a few questions around site prep. Basically, people, Diane in particular was wondering, how do you transition an area with pampas grass to a native pollinator garden? Will cardboard and mulch be enough to choke out the grass?
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
I looked that up, and that's a complicated one. Pampas grass is not native. If it's established, it's very, very deep rooted. Mercanthus, look it up. I'm not a fan of using chemicals, but I think in this case, it might be your best bet. And it says, mow it as low as possible and dig out the roots as best as you can. And using a little bit of glyphosate might be necessary. Otherwise, if you don't want to do that, which is totally understandable, you're going to need to continuously dig it out and as it resprouts, and know that it's probably going to come back for a while. And then this is just like any invasive plant is depriving its ability to photosynthesize and to regenerate, because there's a lot of energy down in those roots, and it's going to want to keep on popping up. So that's a tough one. What you suggested will not work. You have to do a lot more.
Yeah, I agree with Rich on that one. I was also looking at pampas grass and I've had some experience with that. And heard the same thing. I also went ahead and copied a link to our site preparations sort of guide to site prep, and I'm going to put that in the chat right now. It's the Blue Thumb site preparation handout. Again, it's in the resources that are shared to you, but since we're talking about it, I thought I'd post a link there. But agreed, the cardboard won't be enough to keep the pampas grass from coming back. Kind of have to do more for that one. And there was another question, I think, Megan.
And lastly, if you're going to use chemicals, please follow their directions. It's not something to be taken lightly.
Yeah, and the other site prep question was if somebody is using the sheet mulching cardboard method to choke out an area that's been sod or lawn for a long time, do they need to amend the existing soil, or can they start planting once the sod is gone?
I mean, I think generally speaking, they can probably start planting once the sod is gone, unless for some reason you have like very low organic matter in the soil. I think it's probably fine. I would say the one thing about cardboard and sheet mulching is that it can tend to mound your soil. So if you have an existing area and you're going to add cardboard, then say a layer of compost or another layer of cardboard and then some mulch, you're kind of going to make a lasagna, right? One of the things that could do is raise the soil level, and depending on where it is, it could either create a mound, which in some cases could be fine, but in some cases could change the flow of water throughout your yard. So just be mindful of that. That's all. It's not there's nothing wrong with doing that. It's just be mindful of that to make sure that you're not causing a problem with water flow throughout your yard. But otherwise, I think that's a great method because it adds a lot of organic matter to the soil. It takes some time, right? So you need to put the cardboard and compost and mulch down, and then kind of leave it for a while. You're not planting into it immediately. You're going to really wait, a season or even just a couple of months before you can plant into that. And I think we have more about that in that site preparation guide.
Yeah, and I'll just mention if you're doing a more extensive sheet mulching, you may want to request an extension for your grant, and you can email the helpline about that, and we can follow up with you. Sally is wanting to know your input on the best way to protect plantings from rabbits and deer. We did cover this in the kickoff webinar a little bit, but I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are.
Yeah, this is a great
you're
question.
good at this one.
Yeah, this is a really important question. I feel pretty strongly about. Rabbits and deer are a challenge for everyone. And so they tend to really like new baby plants. So these plants that you've just planted, sourced and planted in your yard. If you know that that's a challenge for you, I really do recommend putting some type of barrier fencing around them for the first 2 growing seasons. That allows those plants to get established enough so that they can handle the rabbit predation when they're a couple of years old. And once they're a couple of years old, they're a little woodier, a little tougher, and honestly not as palatable to the rabbits as say the microgreen salad of baby plants that you just planted. So if you think that's going to be a challenge in your yard, just go ahead and fence them off. There are lots of products like bone meal and blood meal and various things that you can use to try to repel them. And I would say they're marginally successful, but you have to reapply them after rain. And it is, we're all busy and don't get to that. And then it just really takes a few hours for those rabbits to do some damage. So if that's a concern, go ahead and fence it. And you want to make sure you pick some type of fencing. And it can be from like your local Ace Hardware, but you want it to have holes that are 1 inch or less. So some type of like smaller chicken wire. If you ask for rabbit prevention fencing in any of your hardware stores, your local hardware stores, they can help you out. They know exactly what to source, and make sure it goes all the way to the ground and there's not a gap so that a rabbit can get underneath that. That's really my recommendation for that.
I would add, this is funny. I just had a consultation today with a woman up in Duluth, and she put in a row of 9-bark, and she's like, "Yeah, I've been just using that spray, and I'm training the deer." She said, "I'm like, no way, you can't train deer, can you?" Well, maybe. And she claims it worked, but I just looked it up. I was curious. It's like, do deer like 9-bark? And according to the Google, it does. They do not, which really surprises me. So maybe it was also the species of plant that she put in. But yeah, fencing is definitely the best way to go. Just thought I'd
Right.
throw that in there.
Yeah, and fencing for herbivore protection is a reimbursable expense for the grant.
That's
Um,
great.
we've got a question. Somebody is asking if they put their pollinator garden near a curb or edge of the road, should they worry about snow plows dumping street snow? And does de-icing salt affect native plants? What should people keep in mind around that?
Yeah, I would just say like it's good to observe your plow habits. So one of the things that can be challenging is sometimes, we can't find our curb in the winter if we get a lot of snow. And I'd say one of the biggest damages to native plants planted right up against a curb is they can simply get scraped out of the ground by the plow. Obviously, that would be a pretty big damage. So if you have an area where that happens, then you need to move your pollinator planting back from the curb. You can always leave a turf strip between your pollinator planting and the back of curb if this is a concern. If the salty snow is going to get piled on it, if you're worried about it being scraped out, then that turf strip, which could be 2 or 4 feet wide, can be a benefit to you to protect those plants, especially when they're young, or just to keep them from being physically damaged from the plow itself.
Yeah. And then of course choosing plants that can tolerate a little bit more salt in that area is probably a wise decision. I do know that Pearly Everlasting, which is on one of the resources, and also a host plant for um, one of our, I think red Admiral maybe butterfly, is somewhat tolerant, and others also, the black-eyed Susans I think have a little more tolerance, as do the beard tongues or the penstemons. So using those plants will help their survivability.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, this one, Pauline is struggling with their wind source drying out their plants. They've tried growing plants, but with the dryness, it's become challenging, especially with not enough winter snow. Any insight on that challenge?
Mulch. Might want to thicken up the mulch a little bit, and make sure it gets watered nicely. That's the only thing I can really think of, to be honest.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
mulch and soil cover. And then, there are a lot of great native plants for dry, rocky, poor soil. And those would be a good source. Hoary vervain, Pearly Everlasting is a good one for difficult soil. Butterfly weed can handle drier soil. So make sure you're thinking about that with your plant selection for your pollinator planting.
Okay. We have 1 minute left. I'm going to try to squeeze in these 2 last questions. Someone is asking, they have an old box elder tree stump. Should they get a stump remover, or is it okay to leave the trunk and plant around it? What should they be considering there?
I would leave it personally if it was a stump that doesn't bother anything. The rotting wood provides home for a lot of great insects and bacteria and life that we often don't see, that's really, really beneficial to the food web. I love leaving snags, rotten wood, things in my landscape, in areas that aren't as visually impactful as others. So it depends on where it is, and your level of aesthetic, what you like, what you don't like, but I would plant around it. If it's a stump, you could put a potted plant on top of it if it's flat, and make it a
Yep.
gnome home.
Thanks. Lastly, Dave is trying to grow some plants from seed. Someone mentioned that plants may need to be conditioned. Can you comment on that? Or any other advice on seed starting?
Stratification's important on some seeds that require freezing and thawing. Um, I don't know. I mean, what is it too late, Jen? I don't think so. I mean, oh, I'm thinking of winter seed sowing, like, or winter sowing. The snow is all gone, although it's snowing tonight. Um,
Yeah, I think that maybe this person was referring to stratification. Conditioning, I think we're talking about stratification. Just
yep.
look up the needs of that individual. Dave, you're shaking your head. That must be you right there. Sorry, I didn't realize you were the one on camera. I'm not exactly sure what you're mentioning in terms of conditioning, unless you're meaning that. So sometimes new plants, when they're started from seed, need some kind of like wind or steam. They can get really leggy, right? Especially if they're being grown indoors. A lot of people will put a fan on them to help give them a little bit of like wind resistance that keeps them from getting too tall and stringy and leggy. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but hopefully that's helpful. I did have somebody ask me a question directly in the chat, Megan, that is relevant to everybody. I'd just like to answer it really quickly.
Yep.
And I know people may need to go. Someone asked if they should ever fertilize their native plants. And the answer is they really don't need fertilizer. So you don't, and when I say fertilizer, I'm thinking of like a bag, of fertilizer that's really a granular applied fertilizer. That's not really necessary. That's what the compost and organic matter that we're recommending does to benefit, that provides the nutrients that they need, and that granular fertilizer is not needed. It's often applied in excess in our landscapes and causes algae blooms in our waterways. So we really don't recommend applying a granular fertilizer. So I just wanted to put that out there in case that was relevant for everyone in the meeting.
And it looked like Dave meant if the plants or seeds need hardening off.
Oh, gotcha.
Stratification.
Well, stratification is to get them to germinate, right? So, and then hardening off is that after they've germinated, before you plant them, you don't want to just set them outside overnight and have them dry or freeze. And so, yes, that's always a good idea. Anytime you have potted plants or you've grown them indoors, you want to set them out for like a couple hours during the day so that they begin to be able to handle, and generally in a shady spot so that they kind of begin to make that transition from your very controlled environment, if you are growing them indoors, to the outdoor environment, which is going to be drier, windier, things like that. So yes, any species hardening off is good because you're starting it in an artificially controlled environment. So that's why that's necessary before transitioning it outside. Thanks for clarifying.
I'm glad that you covered that, Jen, because I was just thinking about, I think mostly indoor plants are like, vegetables, but using native plants too. That's something I haven't done. I put them outside and let nature take care of it.
Great. Well, thanks
Thanks,
again, Jen and Rich. And thank you to everybody for being here and learning more. I will just mention that we sent out an email newsletter Monday morning. If you're not getting those newsletters, please email the L2L helpline. We have a coach request survey in there if you're interested in being matched with a volunteer coach, if you're a first-time gardener or dealing with a challenging situation, and what a couple hours to talk one-on-one with somebody. Otherwise, we'll be sending out a recording of this webinar in the next couple of days. Thanks again, everybody, and I hope you have a great night.
I would also just add, did you mention the healthy soil workshop coming up? If people are interested in healthy soils, that's going to be an exciting one.
Yep. bluethumb.org. Go to our workshops events page and you can get more information on that. Thanks, Rich.
You betcha.
Right.